if we're pleased to host you a year from now, what statistically measurable progress can we expect as a result of your asking for input in your own reforms?
First off, we're not using a case-by-case analysis as we go through for doing pre-market reviews. In those cases, we're actually looking to have more guidance on the expectations across a particular kind of device. We have many of them out now. We think there should be more of them. We'll be able to get a few more out with some changes in efficiencies that we're putting in place, like a core staff to oversee the process and a tracking system and standard operating procedures. But a big increase in guidance documents isn't going to occur with the current resources, because right now I have review staff who are getting pulled between trying to write a guidance document and reviewing applications. We need to have a core staff of technical writers, and we need to have enough of our own expert staff where we can spend the time to do the guidance and not have to pull people away from pre-market review to slow up any of those times. Now, in terms of measurable progress from a year out, most of the things we'll probably see will be on the qualitative side. I think, though, coming out from a year afterwards, what we're hoping to see is some of the times, in terms of overall times, might start to come down. We will see, actually, if we go back and talk to people, you'll hear less concerns about asking for data if data was inappropriate, or asking for data with better for clarification for why. Qualitatively, I think greater success with our interactive review with manufacturers in terms of the engagements that we have. Some of the things to make this work, we need to be able to get out the policies and procedures for everyone to get on the same page if we're going to get maximum value out of this system. So I think in the coming year, we will see things start to turn around. We're going to see firmer implementation as we get a little bit beyond that and those policies are finalized. So you asked about challenges in doing things. When we put out guidance, we open that up for public comment. That's a good thing. We should get public comment. It also takes time. I got asked about the unique device identification rule coming out. That's rulemaking. I have to do an economic analysis. It's required by law. It lays in time. People like that, but it adds time to it. So there are things we're doing, and some of it, because of the process imposed by us by law, will take a little bit longer. The internal changes will take less time. I'll give you one last example. We have set up what we call a Center Science Council. It is our most senior leadership and experienced staff to oversee our science programs. This includes pre-market review. One of the issues that now comes to the Center Science Council is if the review team feels that they want to change what is going to be asked for across a type of device, that is being brought up to senior management for input before a decision is made on it. So we get the weigh-in from senior leadership and more experienced staff. We've already had a case come up as a result, and that wound up changing the dialogue about what we're doing. Those kinds of changes are already going into place, and we're starting to see a difference. I think that will have ripple effects over the coming months.
Well, Dr. Shuren, I'm sure that you can appreciate the concern that you've heard today from my colleagues, and your challenge is a large one, balancing innovation and safety. I don't minimize that. That is a challenge. My colleagues' challenge is to create an economic environment that is conducive with entrepreneurship, and to create a regulatory and, in some instances, litigation scheme that doesn't bleed jobs to other countries. So I look forward to having you back and hearing about the progress that you made, and I would yield a couple of seconds to my colleague from Tennessee, because I promised I would, and I will, whatever time he consumes, I will give to my colleague from Illinois to balance it out. Dr. Desjardins.
Dr. Shuren, I was just listening to the testimony as a whole, and I think that it'd be fair to say that you believe that the FDA's oversight is superior to that of the Europeans.
I believe that the U.S. standard for approval is the robust standard that we should stand behind, and I think that the FDA needs to do a better job in terms of how we run the programs for that standard to make the system work. We also need industry to provide us with the proper and high-quality submissions and with clinical trials of high quality. That will go along the way. And ultimately, though, we need adequate and stable resources to run this program if we're doing it right. You heard from industry that one of the big issues for them is the high turnover rate of our reviewers. We're not going to solve that without the resources to do it. If we're going to put out guidance documents, more of them, that will require additional resources. If we're going to have the capacity we need to handle the growing workload, will be a resource issue. In fact, from 2007, my workload went up 26%. But under the user fee program, the FDA assumes 100% of the risk of the increase in workload. None of that is built into the user fee program. None of it was considered or thought to were going to happen when we renegotiated Medufa 2, and that's had an impact on performance.
As a physician, moving forward, looking at our patients, which we both have great concern for, does it bother you at all that the Affordable Health Care Act is based on the European model?
The Affordable Health Care Act, for better, for worse, and I'm beginning to think maybe for better, left the medical device center out of it, so isn't an issue for me to talk about.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman from Tennessee. I would recognize the gentleman from Illinois.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. You know, as we went through the discussion, I couldn't help but be reminded of my mother, who used to tell us that haste sometimes will make waste, and that it makes more sense to take the time that you need to thoroughly review whatever it is that you're doing, with the idea that the quality of it is just and perhaps even more important than how quickly you're able to process it or get it done. I am convinced, quite frankly, that the process used by our Food and Drug Administration is in fact superior to what we find taking place in other places. I've had the personal experience of having to wait until something was perfected in order to have the level of comfort that my physician wanted to have before we did the treatment. I would urge you not to lower any standards, or not even to think of lowering any standards, but to continue with the intensive effort to make sure that the quality of the instruments, quality of the devices that are going to be used on the American public is of the highest standard. And so I commend you for doing that. I commend the agency for doing it. And if you would care to respond, please do so.
I couldn't agree more that the standard we have in place is the right standard and the one we should apply. And I'm not saying that as a defender of the FDA. I'm saying that as a physician who has taken care of patients. I'm saying that as a person who's been a patient myself, and the same for my family members and friends. I never want to give to them a device that isn't effective and that we don't know isn't effective if we can have that data. Because as a result, I put them at unnecessary risk, and particularly when there are other alternatives out there for them. It's not good for our healthcare system, which does have its challenges. Why do we want to spend money on technologies that ultimately turn out not to work, and the cost of care for people who wind up having worsened conditions because they got an ineffective treatment when they could have gotten an effective treatment? And that is what has happened in Europe with devices that have been found subsequently to be ineffective, and yet patients got them, and not benign treatments. We're talking about implantable devices. So at the end of the day, the U.S. system, I think, is the right system. We just need to get behind it, and we need to make sure that it's as predictable and efficient as it should be.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much.
Thank the gentleman from Illinois. Dr. Shuren, we thank you. As you can tell, this issue transcends the typical partisanship that we see here. It's a very personal issue for all the members on both sides who, believe it or not, are real human beings, have children and parents and spouses, and I wish you luck as you balance innovation, safety, and time. And it's a challenge. And I do look forward to checking back in with you in a reasonable period of time and see what progress you are making. And we wish you the best as you seek to lead the agency.
Well, thank you. And we are very happy to come by, talk to you or the other members or staff at any time at your convenience.
Thank you. We will take a brief recess to set up for the next panel, and if you have a second, some of us might like to come down and thank you. We'll be briefly recessed. We will now welcome our third panel of witnesses, and we thank you for your patience with us this afternoon. From my left to right, your right to left, Mr. Jack Larsen, is that close? General Partner of the Vertical Group, a leading venture capital firm. Dr. David Kelleher, close. President and CEO of the California Healthcare Institute. And Dr. Rita Redbird is a professor of medicine at the University of California, San Francisco, and the chief editor of the Archives of Internal Medicine. Pursuant to committee rules, all witnesses will be sworn in before they testify, so I would ask you if you would rise and lift your right hands. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Let the record reflect all the witnesses answered in the affirmative. You may be seated. I will recognize the witnesses for their opening statements in the order in which I introduced them. So we would start with Mr. Larsen, and you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. My name is Jack Larsen, and I am testifying today on behalf of the National Venture Capital Association. During my 30 years career as a healthcare venture investor, our government has partnered with entrepreneurs to safely speed innovative new devices to market. Over this time, the U.S. became the undisputed leader of global medical innovation. Americans have been first in line for the life-saving devices that U.S. companies produce. And throughout this period, patient safety has always been paramount, and safety must continue to be paramount, even as we strive for the next life-saving innovation. Although revolutionary research is ongoing, fewer groundbreaking medical devices are making it to the U.S. marketplace, and those that do make it are taking longer and costing significantly more. At the same time, other countries have emulated our successful model and have begun to draw innovators and capital away from the United States. And as a result, we are starting to see stagnation within the U.S. innovation ecosystem. A growing body of research suggests that the performance of the FDA has played some role in this decline. For many entrepreneurs, the FDA process has grown unpredictable, if not inscrutable. Working on very short resources to fulfill a broad set of responsibilities, FDA personnel struggle to keep up with their workload. This research shows that review and clearance times for medical devices has significantly increased since 2007. U.S. medical innovation is beginning to migrate overseas, and patients in foreign markets are benefiting before American patients without a corresponding gain in overall U.S. health or safety. The central problem is that the FDA's risk-benefit analysis for novel medical devices, as well as drugs, has grown out of balance relative to its past practices and to current practices in other countries. FDA now weighs risk too heavily and demands unrealistic levels of assurance of benefit, particularly for first-generation therapies. As you know, under current law, all medical devices and drugs must be both safe and effective. But in medicine, safety does not mean the absence of risk. It means a reasonable assurance that the probable benefits of using a device exceed its probable risks. Effectiveness requires that the benefit be clinically significant, which means it must produce a clinically meaningful improvement in the health of a significant portion of the population. We believe that the FDA should establish as a guiding principle a more flexible risk-benefit analysis. This means that while the general requirement for safety and efficacy will always continue to apply, the specific threshold for each element within the equation will change depending on the clinical context. Incidence and severity of disease, urgency of need in the marketplace, prior medical knowledge, and the relative safety of a device should all be considered to explicitly adjust the variables in the safety and efficacy equation. These adjustments might include, for example, reducing the level of evidence required to provide a reasonable assurance, or what constitutes a, quote, clinically meaningful improvement in health, or what portion of a population is deemed to be significant. The flexible safety efficacy paradigm that we are proposing is already implicit and maybe even explicit at the heart of current FDA law. We already have very different review standards for low versus high-risk devices. But research data suggests that this is not being applied correctly or uniformly. A legislative mandate would help FDA senior management implement this common sense principle more broadly within the agency. In addition, the FDA should continue to measure probable benefits against probable risks, instead of an emerging practice of requiring a higher absolute level of evidence of benefit to ensure against a hypothetical or possible risk to health. Medical breakthroughs begin with only a small advantage over the status quo and then dramatically improve over time. This has been true for the past 50 years. Angioplasty is a perfect example. Requiring that all novel products initially demonstrate a high absolute threshold of benefit versus risk will derail many promising new ideas. For devices with low to moderate potential risk, the FDA should significantly expand the use of certified third-party entities for review, as the research suggests this practice is widely used in Europe without sacrificing safety, and we continue to believe in a safety and efficacy standard. We are also advocating for a number of broader reforms, amending the statutory mission to include acceleration of novel therapies to the marketplace, ensuring that individuals with significant expertise can sit on advisory panels, and streamlining the regulation of cross-cutting innovation, including a pathway for personalized medicine, are very, very important. If we act now to implement reforms that bring the FDA risk-benefit equation back into balance, we can revive the U.S. medical innovation ecosystem and ensure that seriously ill patients continue to have access to breakthrough therapies and technologies in a safe and timely fashion. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Lazarson. Dr. Kelleher.
Thank you, Chairman Gowdy and Ranking Member Davis. My name is David Kelleher. I'm the President and CEO of CHI, the California Healthcare Institute, and I appreciate the opportunity today to address several important issues concerning the review and approval of medical devices by the FDA. My testimony is based on a recent report CHI produced with the Boston Consulting Group, BCG, called Competitiveness and Regulation, the FDA and the Future of America's Biomedical Industry. One major theme of this report is that the FDA is a de facto industrial policy, for better or worse, and its operations shape the future of the medical device industry. Now, history shows that a strong, science-based FDA and well-articulated, predictable, and consistent regulatory processes are essential to medical device investment, innovation, and patient care. Unfortunately, in recent years, there's been a significant deterioration in the environment for medical device innovation. Beginning in approximately 2007, evidence clearly confirms that regulation of medical devices has become increasingly slow and unpredictable for both 510K as well as more complex pre-market approval, PMA products. As documented by the FDA's own data in our Competitiveness and Regulation report, comparing 2010 with the period from 2003 to 2007, that's the period of the first medical device user fee law, we note two things. First, that 510K clearances have slowed by 43% during those two periods, and that PMA approval times have increased by 75%. Clearly, part of the problem for this slowdown lies beyond the direct control of the FDA and its leadership. In recent years, for example, Congress has enlarged the agency's scope into new fields, like tobacco, and added to its responsibilities and authority. Yet federal appropriations have largely failed to keep up with new mandates, forcing greater reliance on industry-funded user fees. But perhaps the most important factor in the agency's recent history has been a change in its culture. Faced with accusations from the press, from consumer groups, and some in Congress that its reviews were too lax and failed to protect public safety, the FDA has shifted emphasis in product reviews from benefits of new devices to focus increasingly on their possible risks. Meanwhile, outside the FDA, another form of risk has darkened the prospects for medical technology investment. Beginning in 2008, the Great Recession devastated investment portfolios, including the pension funds and institutional endowments that historically have been the main source of life sciences venture capital. Against this background, levels of regulatory uncertainty, delays, missed timelines, doubts about eventual approval, uncertainty that was uncomfortable in good economic times became intolerable after the economic downturn. especially because investors and executives came to realize that there were practical and more efficient routes to the market outside the U.S. Today, complex medical devices approved via the PMA process in the U.S. are approved in Europe on average nearly 4 years ahead of the U.S., up from just a year earlier over a decade ago. And no evidence exists to suggest that these faster approval times in Europe lead to patient safety-related problems. In fact, a recent Boston Consulting Group study comparing the period from 2003 to 2009 comprehensively in Europe and the U.S. found virtually no difference in product recalls and safety problems. Today, Congress, the FDA, industry, patient groups, and other stakeholders can come together with the will and ideas to improve agency performance, to rejuvenate, support, and sustain a strong science-based FDA, an efficient, consistent, and predictable review process to approve safe and effective medical technologies. Critical to this effort is the need to address, through constructive congressional oversight, more appropriate balance between benefit and risk. Today, the FDA, the press, Congress, consumer groups, and others overwhelmingly focus on direct risk, product side effects, adverse events, technical product failures. But just as important, perhaps even more important to consider, are indirect risk, distortions in the regulatory process, for example. How should we calculate the public health loss to patients if investors and companies avoid entire diseases and conditions because the FDA's standards for data are so extensive and its standards for approval so uncertain? Similarly, we need to understand the cost of regulation, again, both direct and indirect. As this committee and Congress look for ways to create jobs and create a more business-friendly environment, the full cost of the regulatory system should be fully weighed. As the global economy grows ever more connected, American leadership in the medical device faces intense competition for capital, for markets, for talent, and for jobs. As these competitive forces gather momentum, investors, managers, and policymakers ignore them at their peril. If FDA regulation is just one factor among several, it nonetheless can be pivotal. Thank you again for this opportunity to testify. I would be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Dr. Kelleher. Dr. Redbird.
Thank you, Chairman Gowdy, Ranking Member Davis, and other distinguished members for inviting me to submit testimony on medical devices at this important hearing. I am Rita Redbird, MD, Professor of Medicine and full-time faculty and cardiologist at the University of California, San Francisco Medical Center for the last 21 years. I'm also Chief Editor of the Archives of Internal Medicine, one of the most preeminent peer-reviewed journals of scientific research in internal medicine. The journal frequently publishes articles related to use of medical devices. As a practicing cardiologist, I appreciate the advantages that medical devices offer in care of my patients every day. I also know the problems and heartaches that can occur when an implanted device is found not to be effective or has been found to be defective and is recalled. My first priority is high-quality medical care of my patients. Thus, it is critical to me that any approved high-risk device first has been shown to be safe and effective. Unfortunately, this standard is too frequently not currently being met. First of all, only 1% of all devices go through the pre-market approval pathway. Congress envisioned that all Class III devices, those with greatest risk, would be approved through the more rigorous pre-market approval process. However, the 2009 GAO report entitled FDA Should Take Steps to Ensure That High-Risk Device Types Are Approved Through the Most Stringent Pre-Market Review Process found that this congressional directive was not being followed. The report found that the majority of high-risk devices do not go through the original PMA process and instead are commonly approved with no clinical study data. Even the PMA process itself has been found to need improvement in its clinical data requirements. The gold standard for clinical data is randomized controlled trials. Yet our recent study that was published in JAMA found that fully 2/3 of PMA